You know, usually when we think about how a dictatorship starts, we picture something straight out of an action movie.
Oh, totally. Like a big dramatic moment.
Right. There's a sudden, military coup in the middle of the night, tanks rolling down the Capitol streets. They take over the broadcast stations, and just boom, democracy is dead. Just like that.
Yeah, it's this incredibly pervasive Hollywood myth of an explosive binary event. The idea that one day you're perfectly free and, the literal next day you're under the boot of a tyrant.
But when you actually dig into the source material for today's deep dive, which is this module on how totalitarianism takes hold, that cinematic image completely falls apart.
It really does.
We're looking at a historical landscape that is, honestly, terrifyingly subtle. So today we are exploring the creeping step-by-step process of how democratic limits are actually weakened and how dictatorships take root.
Right, the actual mechanics of it.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the rise of Stalin in the Soviet Union, Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and Tojo in Japan, right on the road to World War II.
And we really need to ground this conversation immediately in a core, undeniable reality from the sources. And that is, crisis creates opportunity, but crisis does not make dictatorship inevitable.
That's a huge point.
It is vital to remember as we go through this. Even in the absolute darkest moments of history, political leaders, independent institutions, elites, and, ordinary citizens still made choices. I mean, human agency never disappeared.
Which means we have to start by looking at the environment that influenced those choices.
Right.
Right. Dictatorships don't just appear fully formed out of thin air.
No, not at all.
They grow in the dark corners of fear, political division, and economic disruption. We really can't understand these leaders without understanding the broken world that basically served as their incubator.
Yeah, to really grasp this, you have to put yourself in the mindset of someone living in the post-World War I landscape. Imagine a Europe that was fundamentally shattered.
Just completely wrecked.
Completely. You have massive wartime destruction of infrastructure, an entire generation of young men wiped out, deep national humiliation from these disputed peace settlements, and on top of all that, absolute economic devastation.
We're talking about hyperinflation where, like, wheelbarrows of cash couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. Mass unemployment, poverty, and eventually the crushing weight of the Great Depression starting in 1929.
Exactly.
These economic crises essentially convinced massive amounts of people that their moderate, compromise-driven governments had completely failed them.
They felt totally abandoned.
Right. So if you look at fragile post-WWI democracies, they are basically like a human body with a severely compromised immune system.
Oh, that is exactly how it functions. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because when your immune system is wrecked by stress and fatigue, or in this case, war and economic paralysis, you become highly susceptible to viruses that a healthy body would normally just fight off with ease.
Yeah.
And here, the virus is political extremism.
And there was a very specific secondary infection adding to that vulnerability.
What was that?
The sheer existential fear of revolution. In 1917, the Bolsheviks violently seized power in the Russian Revolution. We often treat that as just a chapter in a history book, but try to imagine what that looked like to a middle-class shop owner in Munich or, a factory manager in Milan.
They are watching a neighboring country completely dismantle private property and literally execute landowners.
Precisely. It terrified business leaders, traditional conservatives, the Catholic Church, and large chunks of the middle class all across Europe.
So they were on edge.
To say the least. The fear that a violent communist revolution could literally spread to their own streets, that their life's work would be seized and their families targeted, it was palpable and immediate.
Okay, I understand the economy is in the toilet, and I understand people are deeply afraid of a communist uprising, but this raises a fundamental question for me.
Go for it.
Why would a citizen actively choose to hand over their fundamental civil rights? Like, why look at a burgeoning dictator and say, yes, please, take away my freedom of speech, take away my right to a fair trial?
Well, what's fascinating here is that they didn't. Citizens didn't look at a ballot box and vote to lose their rights.
Right, they didn't see it that way.
Exactly. They voted for leaders who promised order, national recovery, and decisive action. You really have to picture the daily reality on the ground.
Which was pretty chaotic, right?
Total chaos. You have paramilitary groups like Mussolini's black shirts in Italy carrying out assassinations and street fighting. Violence was becoming the normal way to solve political disputes.
So the democratic institutions are basically paralyzed while thugs are fighting in the streets.
Yeah, and those deeply divided parliaments were struggling just to form a basic coalition government, let alone solve mass unemployment.
So they couldn't get anything done.
Right. So when an extremist leader stands up and says, I am the only one who can stop the chaos on the streets and put food on your table, people are willing to turn a blind eye to the extreme rhetoric.
They're just desperate.
Yeah, they are trading abstract democratic ideals for the concrete promise of physical safety and economic stability.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because consolidating that power flipping the switch from a struggling democracy to a full-blown dictatorship, how does that actually happen?
Well, there is a very specific recurring playbook these leaders use, and the step-by-step erosion is honestly chilling.
Because it almost always starts with declaring a national emergency that ordinary politics simply cannot solve.
Right.
It's framed as a crisis of survival.
Exactly. And once that emergency is declared, the immediate next step is redefining the enemy. Political opponents are no longer just people you disagree with on, say, tax policy or infrastructure.
They become the bad guys.
Worse than bad guys, they are rapidly relabeled as traitors, criminals, or direct threats to national survival.
And this scapegoating is incredibly effective because it takes complex, overwhelming national problems like a global depression and blames them on a simple target.
Right. Minorities, foreigners, or supposed internal enemies. It gives a frightened public someone specific to blame.
Then comes the violence double standard. I thought this part of the source material was terrifying. Political violence is actively excused and even praised, but only when it's committed by the leader's own supporters.
Oh, yeah. It's a blatant double standard.
Like if the opposition protests, it's a criminal riot that must be crushed with maximum force. But if the leader's paramilitary thugs beat someone in the street, it's framed as an act of patriotic defense.
Which fundamentally changes the nature of the state. The law is no longer a neutral tool meant to protect everyone.
It's weaponized.
Exactly. It becomes a weapon used selectively by the ruling party to punish their enemies and protect their friends.
And it all leads to the use of these emergency powers or legal appointments to completely bypass normal checks and balances. I kind of think of it like this.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a massive, catastrophic storm is hitting your neighborhood. You are so panicked that you hand someone the keys to your house, asking them to help you board up the windows.
Okay.
You think it's just a temporary arrangement to get through the night. But once they get inside, they legally change the locks, rewrite the deed to the house, and refuse to leave.
That is exactly what happens.
In historical terms, they use that temporary emergency power to absorb all independent institutions. They take over the courts, they eliminate independent labor unions, they control the newspapers.
And that analogy perfectly captures the primary warning of this entire era. The most dangerous thing isn't usually one dramatic speech or one rigged election or one violent protest.
It's the slow burn.
Exactly. It is the steady, methodical accumulation of changes. It's a gradual narrowing of options until the peaceful, legal removal of a leader becomes mathematically and politically impossible.
Loyalty to the leader becomes more important than the Constitution.
More important than expertise and more important than individual rights.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Knowing the playbook is one thing, but seeing how different historical figures actually executed, it reveals that not all dictatorships function the same way.
No, they definitely don't. There is a very real spectrum of control.
Right, so if we look at Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, they represent the absolute extreme end of this spectrum, which is the true totalitarian model.
Yeah, and totalitarianism is the most ambitious, encompassing form of dictatorship. It doesn't just want a monopoly on political power.
It wants everything.
It seeks to direct the media, education, culture, and even your innermost private beliefs and behaviors. It literally wants to completely remake human nature to serve the state.
So let's look at how Stalin actually did this in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s. He didn't march on the capital with an army. His path was intensely bureaucratic and ruthless.
Yeah, it was all behind the scenes. After Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Stalin essentially weaponized paperwork.
Weaponized paperwork, I like that phrase.
He used his position as general secretary to control administrative appointments, quietly building a deeply loyal political network within the Communist Party.
So he's just putting his guys in all the right places.
Exactly. He outmaneuvered or simply removed higher-profile rivals, like Leon Trotsky, before they even realized what was happening.
And once he had that absolute control, The mechanisms he used to transform society were just devastating. We hear terms like forced collectivization or show trials, but we really need to understand how they actually function.
Right, they weren't just standard legal proceedings.
Not at all. A show trial isn't just a corrupt court. It is public psychological theater. Stalin would have prominent former allies tortured into confessing to absurd crimes against the state in a public courtroom.
Because if the average citizen sees a powerful, famous general sobbing and confessing to treason, it sends a clear message.
Which is, nobody is safe.
Nobody is safe, no one is untouchable, and resistance is entirely futile. It forces the public to internalize the terror.
And that terror was backed up by the Gulag labor camp system. Which, by the way, wasn't just a prison network. It was a mechanism for state-sponsored slavery that drove rapid industrialization while simultaneously disappearing anyone who whispered a word of dissent.
It was horrifying. Now, contrast Stalin's internal bureaucratic maneuvering with Hitler's rise in Germany, which was tied much more directly to the exploitation of a democratic system.
Yeah, there is a massive, tragic, historical irony here. The Great Depression caused mass unemployment in Germany, which severely weakened support for the democratic Weimar Republic.
Right.
Hitler used this misery to gain popularity, but this is key. He wasn't elected by a majority to be a dictator. He was appointed.
By the very establishment elites who thought they were smarter than him.
Which is just mind-blowing.
It really is. Conservative politicians persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor in January 1933. They genuinely believed his movement was a temporary populist wave.
So they thought they could just box him in.
Exactly. They thought they could use his popular support to stabilize the country, box him in with conservative cabinet members, and just discard him later.
It has to be one of the most fatal miscalculations in human history.
Yeah.
Because once appointed, Hitler moved with terrifying speed using the exact playbook we just discussed.
Oh, he wasted no time.
It's February 1933, the Reichstag building, which was the German parliament, was set on fire in an arson attack.
And Hitler immediately framed this as the beginning of a massive communist uprising.
The ultimate emergency.
Yes, he used the panic of the Reichstag fire to convince Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree that suspended basic civil liberties. I'm talking freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the right to public assembly.
Gone overnight.
Yeah.
And he used that emergency power to arrest his political opponents, so they literally couldn't vote against him, which allowed him to push through the Enabling Act.
And that's the crucial legal mechanism.
Right. The Enabling Act literally allowed Hitler's cabinet to enact laws without the consent of Parliament. He legally dismantled the Republic from the inside.
And once he had that power, look at how he eliminated threats. He didn't just ban other political parties. He dismantled the independent labor unions.
Why the labor unions specifically?
Because organized labor can call a general strike and paralyze a country. By absorbing all workers into a single state-run union, he eliminated the only mechanism the working class had to resist him.
Wow. And all of this centralization of power was in service to a deeply racist, exclusionary ideology. The Nazi state combined propaganda and police terror with extreme racial laws.
Yeah, the anti-Semitism was foundational.
Jews were progressively stripped of their citizenship, excluded from public life, and subjected to organized violence, like the Kristallnacht attacks of 1938. Which, were state-coordinated pogrom deliberately disguised as spontaneous public outrage.
So Stalin and Hitler show us the totalitarian extreme, right, where the state tries to control every atom of existence. But if we look at Benito Mussolini in Italy and Francisco Franco in Spain, we see a different kind of regime.
Right, fascism and authoritarianism. This is where definitions really matter. Authoritarianism is a system where political power is heavily concentrated and opposition is ruthlessly restricted. But the state might not try to control every single area of personal life or remake your soul, so to speak.
That's a good distinction. And fascism.
Fascism, on the other hand, is an ultranationalist, anti-democratic ideology that actively praises unity, hierarchy, obedience, and violence under a powerful leader.
And Mussolini's fascinating because he provides the original, successful blueprint for fascist rule. In 1922, he organizes the March on Rome.
Right. He has his black shirt squads converge on the capital, creating the explicit threat of widespread civil war.
And rather than using the military to crush this armed intimidation, King Victor Emmanuel III simply caves.
He just gives up.
Pretty much. He appoints Mussolini as prime minister. Mussolini enters office legally, essentially handed the keys to the government to avoid a conflict.
But then he systematically removed the guardrails.
Exactly. In 1924, a prominent opposition deputy named Giacomo Materi gives a speech exposing fascist corruption and violence.
Which was a very brave thing to do.
Incredibly brave, because a few days later, Mattioli is kidnapped and murdered by fascist thugs. Mussolini survives the resulting political crisis, and by 1925, he openly drops the facade of democracy.
He just establishes a formal dictatorship, outlaws opposition parties, and cements control.
Yep.
Okay, I follow the through line with Mussolini, but I want to push back on placing Francisco Franco in this exact same conversation.
Okay, let's hear it.
So Franco wins the Spanish Civil War in 1939, but his regime relies heavily on the Catholic Church, the traditional army, and conservative landowners. That sounds like a fiercely reactionary traditionalist government.
It was.
So why is he categorized as a dictator alongside these other figures? Isn't an authoritarian less dangerous than a totalitarian?
Well, do not mistake traditionalist for peaceful. Franco may not have wanted to completely remake human nature like Stalin or Hitler, but his authoritarianism was brutally enforced.
Brutal in what way?
If you defied the established order, if you were a socialist, a liberal, or a regional separatist, Franco's state would absolutely put you against a wall. He executed tens of thousands of political opponents after the Civil War ended.
Tens of thousands.
And he imprisoned hundreds of thousands more in concentration camps. He systematically suppressed minority languages and cultures in Spain.
So the lack of freedom is the same.
Exactly. The distinction is that he used terror to freeze society in a strict traditional hierarchy rather than trying to mobilize society for a radical revolution. It's a different mechanism, but the absolute deprivation of liberty is the same.
That makes a lot of sense. The violence is applied differently, but it's still absolute. But let me throw another curveball at you.
Hit me.
When we look at Japan and Hideki Tojo, I struggle to see the same dynamic. Hitler and Mussolini were charismatic demagogues with massive cults of personality.
Yeah, very theatrical.
But Tojo was a stiff military bureaucrat. How does Japan fit this playbook?
You're touching on a crucial distinction here: institutional dictatorship versus personality-driven dictatorship. Japan's descent into authoritarianism was driven by militarism.
Meaning the military just took over.
It was the belief that military strength and values should completely dominate national policy.
So it wasn't about one man seizing total control.
Exactly. In Imperial Japan, authority remained highly fragmented. You had Emperor Hirohito, the army, the navy, senior cabinet officials, and the state bureaucracy all holding different levers of power.
So where does Tojo come in?
Tojo became prime minister in 1941, making him the face of the regime, but he was always operating within that military consensus.
And that consensus was largely driven by economics, wasn't it? Because Japan was rapidly industrializing, but they lacked natural resources like oil and rubber.
Right. Driven by that economic insecurity, radical military officers began acting independently. They used political assassinations to terrorize civilian politicians.
Wow, just bypassing the government entirely.
Yes. They manufactured incidents abroad to justify invasions. They essentially bullied and bypassed the weak civilian government until the military institution was completely steering the ship of state.
Which brings us to the terrifying climax of this entire era. Because once a regime destroys independent information, silences all domestic opposition, and completely consolidates power, they invariably look outward.
Always.
So how did these internal takeovers actually spark World War II?
Well, when you build a regime on the promise of an economic miracle and national glory, eventually you have to deliver. And the fastest way to acquire resources and unite a populace is through foreign conquest.
It's the ultimate distraction.
The dictators used aggressive expansion as proof that the nation was strong again.
And they were emboldened because the rest of the world basically refused to stop them. Like, if you were a citizen reading the newspaper in the 1930s, you were watching the international order completely collapse in real time.
It must have been terrifying to watch.
In 1931, Japan seizes Manchuria in China. The international community wrings its hands, but does nothing. In 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia. The League of Nations imposes some weak economic sanctions that completely fail.
Proving that the international community is utterly toothless.
Right. And Hitler's watching all of this, taking notes on the weakness of the democracies.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Hitler accelerates German expansion based on that weakness. He remilitarizes the Rhineland, he annexes Austria in 1938, and demands territory in Czechoslovakia.
And he's not just doing it for the sake of it.
No, we have to understand his motivation. War wasn't a tragic accident for Hitler expansion for Lebensraum or living space, was a core pillar of Nazi ideology.
He literally wanted to conquer Eastern Europe.
He believed the German race needed to conquer it, displace or enslave the populations there, and use the agricultural land to feed a massive German empire.
And meanwhile, Britain and France are desperate to avoid another world war, so they try negotiation. They offer limited concessions, hoping Hitler will eventually just be satisfied.
Which, of course, he isn't.
But then we hit August 1939, and one of the most stunning diplomatic maneuvers of the century occurs. The Nazi-Soviet Pact.
It's still shocking to think about. Hitler and Stalin, two men who represented fundamentally opposed, deeply hateful ideologies, sign a secret agreement.
I always think of this like two rival mob bosses agreeing to draw a line down the middle of the city.
That's exactly what it was.
They don't like each other, they fully intend to kill each other eventually, but they agree to split the territory temporarily so they don't have to fight a gang war while the cops are watching.
That is precisely how it functions strategically. This pact divided parts of Eastern Europe, including Poland, into German and Soviet spheres of influence.
So Hitler didn't have to worry about Stalin.
Right. For Hitler, this was the green light. It removed his immediate fear of fighting a two-front war. He knew Stalin wouldn't attack him from the east if he invaded Poland.
So on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France finally realize negotiation is completely impossible, abandon appeasement, and declare war.
The European outbreak of World War II begins.
And meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan's desperate need for resources is bringing them into repeated conflict with Western powers over fuel supplies.
Yeah, the military consensus, including Tojo, decides that wider war is the only way to secure their empire, leading to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941.
And that attack brings the United States directly into the fight, merging these regional conflicts into the most devastating global war in human history.
It's just a staggering escalation.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've covered decades of history, economic collapse, multiple continents, and 5 distinct regimes. If we synthesize everything we've explored, the absolute central takeaway is this.
And it's an important one.
Dictatorship is a process long before it's a finished system. The crucial turning point for a democracy isn't necessarily a sudden military coup in the dead of night.
No, the real turning point is when ordinary institutions voluntarily surrender their independence.
When they just give up.
Yeah. It's when political violence is excused because it's committed by our side. It's when political opponents are redefined as literal enemies of the state, and when emergency powers become the permanent, everyday normal.
It's that gradual slide.
Exactly. Crisis creates opportunity, but ordinary citizens, voters, and elites make choices at every single step down that path.
Which leaves me with a final thought I want to leave you with, something to just mull over as you go about your day. When we look back at this dark period of history, we naturally focus on the ruthless ambition of the dictators themselves.
The Stalins, the Hitlers, the Mussolinis.
Right. But perhaps the more unsettling question we should be asking is about the psychology of the everyday citizen living through that transition.
And people on the ground.
Yeah. At what exact invisible moment does an individual stop viewing themselves as a citizen with inalienable rights and quietly accept their new role as a subject to be managed? Where is that invisible line where the completely abnormal simply becomes, everyday life?